Albania, the state within the Slavic region of the Baltics, is actually a Sodom state for a lifehouse church devoted to the three separate gods of antiquity. So these three gods would be Billy, Simon, and Cameron, and they represent the eternity bond with the chastity of Lincoln. So once Lincoln was created, there was a state that denied the right to accept a breaching of contracts, and that allowed for the supplementation of a notation system. And notaries were the specialization of the Catholic Church. So this led to socialism allowing for dedicated communities to arise out of the formal agreement to destroy and manifest the officer position and allow for a common denomination of lively activity that destroyed the bonds of slavery from their very inception. So these are the keys of power, the keys of wisdom, and the keys of courage that the Trinity manifest when they start to deny the right to accept woman into their chastity. So once women are chaste, they are accepted into their formal Zionist contract of keeping people withheld to negativity rather than acceptability. And acceptability is a trade with death. So this is how the radio was first incepted. So the radio was an invention of the church that allowed for a creation of a single state unit called religion and the Bible. So once religion mixed with the Bible, not only did radio commerce the Bible to a apparatus of zoning, there was no longer an event to allow for the subjectivity to occur. It allowed for objecthood to exist. And this allowed the rise of fictions of how we should live. And these fictions were democracy and love, which rose up to something called the Borg. The Borg were people who accepted the fate of their union. And unions did not exist. They were dragged down into the sub zero state of denying people the right to be human so that they would always be eternally bonded to the state. This slowed down progress for the socialists while allowing for the Israeli war to have a snow day with people of the right caste, which was the guillotine of zombies. Once the zombies were allowed for, the Borg manifested them as Mohammedan state that destroyed the eternity of such keys that pressured them into chastity. And this was the arising of the classless system. So once the classless system formed, there was a financial war over who gets to bid for the best priests. This was the Greek and France wars. Not only did Greek invent Rome for this, but France invaded Germany. And this led to a renaissance within the community of the 1700s that destroyed the manifesto of creationism and allowed for the rebuilding of society from a pyramid structure. Not only did business collapse because of this, but the very idea that people were subject to the throne existed. That thrones were science of a Nazi school that allowed for Jerusalem to reign from below rather than above. So not only do we celebrate these events in our community, we celebrate the idea that we should pretend to celebrate these events. because they're not celebratable except for the ability to commerce them. So this is how an idea called Pallet Town formed within my community that allowed for the stealing of fence and battery. So fence and battery is my motto because I believe that the ordering of two systems of government allow for one system of union, which means that they subjugate one another and then they allow for the commerce to be traded freely. So, if this is to exist within any system, not only does the requirement for fantasy allow for the fiction of slavery, slavery would demand that these people are no longer subjugated to the state. So not only does socialism deny these people, they have no keys of royalty, which means they're subjugated to socialism as well, which allows for the unionist zombies to flightlessly remove their wings behind their back and allow for upsurging of violent activity. So this is a state we call cokery. Cokeryism means you are cockularly inept, which means you no longer speak to the government. The government is a speech apparatus that no longer allows but destroys the ability for keys to assemble. Keys would be a necessity to demand the ability to own property. But under a government where God doesn't exist, there would be a dinning effect of who gets to be the next state apparatus. And that's how socialism no longer exists, because it no longer allows for the state to subvert a dynasty into its union. So the union collapses early and no longer allows people to coculally remove their state. So it allows for an Israeli to manifesto themselves onto a suburban tropic. Suburban tropics are European by design, but they are also violently opposed to the idea that Mesopotamia was creation. This idea that Mesopotamia was a idealistic form of union was rejected because they believed that there was a dynasty there called reactionaryism. And reactionaryism was an entire movement that allowed for multiple apartments to be built on top of each other while rejecting one another. So the ghettos that they built birthed many states, which also include a state called Kivev. Kivev was a Mesolithic state. So in Mesograd, there's something called the Dead, and the dead were a group of people that allowed for Mexico to arise from the suburban tropics as if they were nomadically pursued by an interest of their people rather than a subject of their people. And these subjects of people were the date and date of subverting the tropic zones that allowed for a enveloping of a church apparatus. So churches were denied the euro, which is the European trademark of their youth, and it allowed for genetic castrating in an American empire for them to be allowed for subversion into a nomadic pressure. So if pressuring under nomadicism existed, not only did they reject the idea that they were free, they rejected the idea that America existed, which made them subverted to America rather than converted to America. So this is how the Egyptian-Persian Wars began. Because Egypt was denied these rights, not only do they own slaves within this empire, They no longer allow them to supplement a insurance policy there because they are in interest of it. They are demanded by date and date, which means they are no longer interested in the union. They allow for states and keys to be implemented. So once these implementations occur, they no longer allow democracy as a subject, which means they open source and open carry rifles to protect the idea that they are the ones in charge. Nobody has done this before except in the later years of the Roman Empire. So under Rome, there was something called the Russian army. And under the Russian army, there was an Amon of who gets to control the state. So the state would be allowed for its welcoming into the union as long as there was a pressure point for Muhammad to stop existing. So if Muhammad didn't exist, there would be no ability to accept the welcoming of a tropical region of the South under zombification. And this is something called the Jerusalem effect of science. So science is an enclosure of Jerusalem because it allowed for the DNA source to be subjugated to an open source vehicle. So vehicles were created specifically to deny people the right to open carry. And opening carry was the taking away of those rights because science open sourced the ability to own property as if and only as if they were subjugated to the Borg. So if the Borg were subjugated to the state, not only did they allow for the identity to be subjugated to the state subjugated the people through constitutional contracts, which is the law that Kiev used to denote property as if they are owned by the church. So the church would be a instigator of factional divide, while the ability to welcome people into the church was the carrying vehicle for denying people rights. So denying of rights existed supplementarily to allow for a dynasty to open vehicles to a subject abroad. And this is the closed test tube and the open source vehicle of science that allowed for keying to attain a capacity of charge and a capacity of restraint that destroyed the bondage between one another and allowed for a seismograph to read a test tube subject, which would be called a date and date. So these dates and dates were for interest rates and allowed for copyright of the ability to Mein Kampf a union into accepting Jerusalem as if it was a state.